Hello and welcome to this, another episode of Frame and Reference. I'm your host, Kenny McMillan, and you're listening to episode 114 with Nick Matthews, DP of Saw X. Enjoy.
It's like they've been doing, I remember when the first Blackmagic cinema camera came out, and I was like, okay, because
the one that was the screen with the lens mount.
And because this is like the very specific camera in terms of camera technology. Like I started shooting when it was I think my first cameras I was using were like the Z1U, like the Sony,
okay,
Sony HDV, where it was they had a line skipping and but it was pretty early, and then the XL1, the XLH1,
I still have my XL2 in the closet.
Yeah. Oh my God. The HEX 200. The very first cameras I ever touched were Ikegami,
the tube.
the tubes. Yeah. And then because I worked for a religious organization when I was in high school and college. And they did a lot of promo things and shit like that on those kinds of cameras. And that was kind of where I started playing with cameras. And then when the DSLR revolution came out, sort of happened. And suddenly I just finished college at the time. And I remember being holy shit, this is crazy. And at the time it's the Red 1, the Red M and then the Red MX, those were kind of happening. And so everything was sort of, there's so much transition. And I'm one of those people that did started when digital cinema was really starting to take off.
Right.
And so I never had the opportunity to shoot on film, except for I've had 3 opportunities. I've shot on it on 16. One was, I was in high school and someone had an old Canon Scopic camera, which is it's Vietnam War era technology. They're designed to be used in war photography. So it's a really easy loading system. You can do it at a solo, and you can do it in under gunfire. And then a couple of years ago, a friend of mine, I was like, no one's going to let me shoot on film until I do it. So
right.
I was like, if you have a music video or you have something come up or a short or you want to do something on spec, let's shoot something on 16. And we had this music video with this, this indie rock band. It was all it was a narrative. There was no performance in the video. And we were like, cool, let's toss our rates in. I think we had $10,000 total. So it was all right, we'll put in neither of us will make any money. We'll hire a good crew. We'll do everything else we need to do and then make something on 16. And so I've had a couple of those experiences, but both of them were great learning experiences. But it was weird to kind of reverse engineer shooting on digital, being really familiar with zebras and false color and waveforms and histograms, and those being the ways in which I started to understand darkness and how I shot. And I remember very early on being oh, with digital, if I blow it out, it will look horrible. You know what I mean? And so I got really in this space of let's start with shooting images with a certain level of darkness and kind of etching images out of the darkness. So it's on those old cameras where they weren't, full frame sensors, and they weren't APS, C size sensors or 35 millimeter size sensors. You would stack the ND, you would shoot longer lens, and you would open up. Or, I never was a cool enough kid to have the those lettuce or
there was
the DAP.
That is, and there was the Red Rock. We've talked about these a lot on the podcast. There's a lot of people who I don't know if we look back fondly on them, but we've all been when we're talking, old men screaming at clouds. It's always you don't know how hard you had it. We had to take a DVX 100 and put about 1.5 miles of metal tubes on the front.
Yeah, and then the results were subpar. At the end of the day,
you lost 4 stops of light.
Yeah. Yeah, so it was a big, I don't know, that's always been a weird thing. Now I'm I am not, I do care about cameras, but I'm a little more camera agnostic, and I just think the technology has gotten so good. I have my preferences, but at the same time, like the last 3 movies I've shot, I shot this movie in Georgia that just came out called Mobland. It's got John Travolta, Stephen Dorff. Was one of those like very much a movie made by like a company that does direct to video type movies. And we were like, how do we elevate this and make this something more? But in the process, it's a $5 million movie being made in 11 days. And I think we shot 3 days splinter unit, but as a result, like my camera decisions were like what was affordable, because we were shooting in Atlanta and gear in Atlanta goes for a higher value because the market is pretty saturated.
Yeah, super.
And also, there's just actually not as many rental houses as you would think. And so we flew gear in from LA for that movie, and we were shooting on mini LF with easy zooms. And then we had black wings, which when we got into some of the night work, we had to flip to those. And then we matched in an Alexa Mini as our C camera to that with a set of standard speeds. But then that was just, I've tended to shoot on Arri products just because I'm very familiar. I know the color science. But then when I got onto Saw, we had a 4K capture mandate on that as well. And at the time, this was back in, we shot principal photography for Saw X in October, November. And then we shot in January, February, because the prosthetics were not going to be finished in time for us to shoot in the first half of the shoot. So we ended up pushing, basically, we went down for December, and then we came back and wrapped the movie. And on that film, I was shooting in Mexico City, and the availability of cameras and the availability of lenses became a determining factor, because we had the Venice and the Venice 2, those were options we looked at. The Venice 2 was very unavailable and pretty expensive.
Yeah.
The Alexa Mini LF was available, but the lens options for it were very unavailable. And we were on Saw X, we were very much looking for a vintage quality glass. We wanted something that, even though we knew we were going to be shooting digitally and we knew that we were going to be shooting 4K, we wanted to harken back to the earlier films, which were shot 35 millimeter. They're gritty, they're dirty, they're grimy, they're textural. There's a bit of a, they make you feel like you want a tetanus shot. And so for us on the movie, it's like, how do we bring that in knowing we're using a digital sensor? And so for us, it was like, we shot on a set of the Cook Classic Eye Pink Rose, or however, the naming convention of that set of lenses is so terrible.
Yeah.
But
lenses in general don't have great until you get to like the Black Wing or like the Hawks, right, or whatever. It's like, yeah.
But those, like, they're
my speed Pancrose Super. You're like, who makes that?
Yeah, like great, they're modern glass in terms of the design and the like the quality control, but then the aesthetic of it is vintage. And so like I did a bunch of tests to show Kevin Gruert, the director, and I showed him a ton of different like large format lenses. Nothing quite spoke to us, and the ones that did, we couldn't afford. And so even though, this is a franchise movie, this franchise is started from like something that was very much in this like $1 million range. Obviously the movies have gotten bigger than that, but these are not $100 million movies. These are movies that are being made, we still couldn't afford 2 sets of lenses. We had 2 Venices. The main reason we settled on the Venice was global shutter was an issue, was a thing we wanted. 4K capture meant everything but the Varicam, the Mini LF, the red, which I just haven't used the red in so long. And
there's still, the Raptor's nice, but they're still.
Yeah. They just have, they're not for everybody. And for us, the Venice made sense because single stop ND. Also, we wanted to shoot at higher ASAs and start to bake in some grain as well, which that could have been done on the Mini LF or the Venice. But ultimately, it came down to we could get Super 35 lenses on the Venice in a way that was going to work better for us than on the Mini LF. And so that veered our decision making, and we ended up using a pearlescent 1 for that film, and we filtered it. It's great. We added grain in post, but we shot mostly at 2000 ASA, and and that's an example of like okay, that's a 4K capture mandate. We shot it in 4K. But then I wrapped Saw, and a month later, I was in Georgia shooting another movie. So I had like a string, which was really exhausting and really great. And then the strikes happened, and I've been pretty dead.
And you were like, nailed it.
Like, oh, cool. Like, yeah, it's great sitting around. Because I just, I do commercials, but I'm somebody who sometimes gets to do commercials, and I've been able to do movies. And so like, it's still an arena that I would love to play more in. But this last movie, it was my second feature with this director I had done a horror movie for Shudder with, which the Shudder movie, we had 18 days. It was $600,000. We shot it on the Mini, and we shot it at super speeds and used a Blackmagic as our B camera. This movie that we did in Georgia was, $4 or $5 million, tier 1 union film. Bigger toys, we had Condors and 18Ks, and but we still ended up shooting on 2 Alexa Minis. We shot on a set of Hawk V lights, and then, we ran 2 cameras. Similarly, couldn't afford 2 lens sets for the run of show. Like, we just had to make, one set work. And so, and that's an example of like, we didn't have a 4K capture mandate. We knew that shooting every raw and like highest resolution, which I think is like 3.2K or 2.8K. And anamorphic.
3. Oh, and anamorphic, I think you're right. I think it's 2.8.
Yeah, but the blow up is like something we weren't worried about. We shot it
great.
Yeah. And we shot it all at 1600 ASA. And it's like, knowing that we could, like, we'll deliver and sell the movie and it'll end up on streamers and whatever. And so that's where I'm like, yeah, the camera technology has gotten to a point where, there are advantages. Like the Venice is heavier, the Venice is a little bigger. But at the same time, like, if you're doing stuff like with flashing lights, or you're doing stuff with where you're doing like a lot of daytime exteriors, there's advantages to that camera system, So we didn't use Rialto mode very much on Saw, just because it costs more to have Rialto mode available all the time.
Yeah, it's like an expensive little cable, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, and there's the timing it takes to break the camera. So like, even on something like, we were running 2 cameras for most, like all those shoots I just mentioned were 2 camera shoots, and they were pretty much running 2 cameras nonstop. So like, we did not have the luxury of shooting with a body that then we would break a body off. We still did that a few times where it's like, hey, we're going to Steadicam, like, let's drop this body and like have it start prepping for like 15 to 20 minutes. Right. And then, that kind of thing we would do in order to speed our transition time up. But in general, it's like, no, like you're lighting and shooting for 2 cameras most of the time. Yeah, I don't know. So like, I think we're in a really like fortunate space now where there are a lot of great digital options. And then at the end of the day, like, it still does come down to the right colorist or the right amount of time with the right colorist. No matter the, like, in Mexico City, I didn't have my DIT on much before the shoot. I think we were doing makeup and hair tests on a Saturday before we started shooting on Monday. And I'm like, this isn't enough time for me to change the LUTs, And so like our LUT for Saw X was, I had only tested it indoors. I'd not gotten a chance to test it outdoors, and it just didn't work outdoors. And so like it's like I'm operating a camera, I have a B camera operator, and I'm trying to also work my DIT to finesse the LUT. And you're just like, okay, I just need to know, like, in the grade, have I blown anything out? And like my brain with that camera too, it's like the false color on the Venice is a different like color palette than on the Alexa Mini. And so for a while I was like, oh my God, am I severely underexposing this image? Because the color of blue is so close to their color of purple for like different IRE. But anyway, yeah.
Does the Venice use the Lockman zones?
I don't even remember at this point. I think it's like,
say EL. Yeah, I don't. Only reason I ask is I get to interview that guy, like a couple weeks.
Really?
Because he just shot something. But I was like, it didn't occur to me that like a dude, like normally like something like false color you imagine was an engineer.
Yeah.
But it's like, and it was. But then there's Ed Lockman, who was like, no, this needs to make sense for DPs. So he like made his own version that various camera companies have started to implement.
Really, I didn't realize he had, because I mean, obviously like Carol's great, and some of the, like his other films have been like just like so stunning. And
yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, I didn't realize that.
I think the Alexa does it. I think the Venice, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's just like, those are really, to me, those are such like, because I came from doing like smaller, like, you know, it's my first lighting sort of started with like just me and a camera, and it's like, it's gotten bigger over time, and there's been more pieces involved. And like, even the shift from being non-union to union has been like a transition for me. And so like, yeah, like there are certain just rhythms and expectations and sort of approaches that become, you know, you're a C500 back and forward. You know what I mean? You know where the buttons are, you know, like, oh, if I hit this hotkey, like it's going to take me to this sort of a thing. And those, to me, like learning the gear is actually like so much of that. When I started my career, that was a big part of my thinking and my time and my process. Now, like my testing and my interest in gear, it exists, but it's very much like, I want this to be that, like, that thing that happens in the background that I don't consider or need to consider. And this is just like, you know, it's like when it's like, I know how to do addition, and now we're in like physics class. Like, you're not thinking about that sort of minor computation. That's
right.
And I feel that way with gear, but every time I use a new piece of gear, it's sort of like there are idiosyncrasies and stuff like that you're sort of figuring out and picking up along the way.
It's definitely something that like, it's hard because like you were saying, like most people don't actually use Canon stuff. And I'm always having to be like, because I'm a freelance colorist as well. So I work on all my own stuff. And so I always have to be like, trust me, you're going to like the way this looks, you know, and especially paired with like these guys. I know you mentioned it online, but the Yule AIS Nicors, I want these to get rehoused so bad, but it's going to cost me like 20 grand. So that's not for today.
I know. I've been looking at I haven't shot anything on them, but I've been looking at, because I know there's a couple of people who have sets that are like rehoused. And I'm so curious, because I used to shoot on them a bunch. And I own a few. Yeah.
I think it's the perfect, you know, when people were really getting horny over the K35s, I was just like sneaking the Nicors on the set, because I'm like, like the K35s almost go a little too much of a look. Like if you want that, great. But when some people are like, I don't know, we just kind of like, they weren't married to this idea of having such a strong look. Like the Nicors are the perfect balance between vintage, but also sharp and like high quality and whatnot. Cause
the only weird thing about those lenses, they do like the focus wheel is reversed.
Yeah.
Which I don't know if that's something they can change if you get them housed, if they can. What it is.
Yeah. My buddy who runs Zero Optic has rehoused a bunch of them. And that is one thing they do, is they swap the focus.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're one of, exactly them. And like, there's one other company I had seen that, but that's something I've wanted to use a set of those, because I also think I just would love to see them on 16, or I'd love to see them on like 35. And there's a couple DPs in the UK that I've seen doing work with it. And I'm just like, that's so stunning. And the bokeh is great.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of things I love about those lenses. Yeah. That was my first set of lenses I ever really was shooting with. That was like, not just like a 24 to 105s,
right.
Lens were the Nikkor, like that series of like those still lenses. And they just, there's something pretty special about them.
You know, what's funny is, so I know you were saying like your first cameras were the camcorders, same here, but then I got that XL2, and then you had mentioned off camera about the T2i, which I don't know I think everyone was just really stoked on the 5D, and then the T2i was affordable, but like everyone I knew had a T2i. And my dumbass, which was just hipstery from the beginning, bought a Nikon D90 because it was the first camera to get video. So I thought that was cool for some reason. and it did 24p because the 5D at the time only did 30.
That's right.
And I thought 24p was like, I was like, this is real cinema. So, and you weren't gonna post conversion was like way harder. You had to do pull downs and shit. But I had all these Nicors. My uncle sold me his F2, so I had all these Nicors ready to roll, and I never thought to use them. It's the same mount, but like when I was using the D90 to shoot stuff, I was always using the like 18 to 55 Sigma zoom. Like it never at the time lenses were not like, well, I was a fucking college student and I was focused on other things, but heaven.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also so much to like, you just learn so much in the process, and like you learn so much as you continue to make things and grow, and like that affects what you do in the future. And I probably still shot more like pieces of work on the super speeds than any other piece of glass, and like even the very first short film I ever did outside of college was like Red MX on a set of super speeds, and it's like maybe there's something I like about them, and also they were fast and pretty cheap and had a great look, you know what I mean? And I think that's kind of been the fun aspect of like continuing to get to shoot and continuing to get to test is like, for me, like most modern glass is pretty much, you can put them all in the same category. They like handle most of the world the same way. Like I know there are minor differences, and it's like, you're obviously like if you shoot on a master prime versus like you're gonna get different looks, but at the same time, like there are a lot, it's a fairly minor difference between a lot of this like very modern glass that's very clean and very like perfect. And then getting a chance to play with all those vintage lenses and some of the newer lenses, modern glass that's been designed to feel vintage has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, I remember, so like, everyone again talks about the vintage lenses and wanting a look and all this. And so I remember when we were at Cinegear, I was talking to a guy who put up a lens test. It was like all the major lenses. And then I think, I could be editorializing here, but I think they wrote down what they thought would be their favorite. And then it was a blind test. And then they wrote down what their favorites actually were, like in order. Yeah. And apparently across the board, CP2s. Wild. Everyone thought the CP2s were, and that shocked me because I always thought those things were like CA monsters. But yeah, and I watched a couple lens tests recently, and I think what happens is when you just get like the same image back to back to back to back, you very quickly become annoyed with imperfection. I can see some CA there. Oh, the contrast is a little low there. And then like a really nice sharp thing pops up and you go, oh yeah, I can see that. And then it ends up being a master prime, a CP2, Nikkor, like whatever, one of those kind of more modern, sharper lenses.
Yeah. I think kind of, and like, Saw X was my first movie that was made under the umbrella of a studio and also like is a franchise film. Because like Mobland is a Lionsgate release, but it was made without a lot of involvement from anyone. And then essentially like, I think the it's like a distributor sells it to Lionsgate, and then it's sort of like a release by that or something.
That's the Lionsgate MO, baby.
Yeah, exactly. And then whereas Saw, technically Saw, I think, when it was produced, I think they discussed it as an independent production, but it's like, that it's a Lionsgate property, that it's going to release under the Lionsgate banner. And so I still had no studio involvement in terms of like setting the looks, watching anything. Like there was no, the only person that watched any of the lens tests were me and Kevin, the director. Mm. And it's like, the two of us in a room, ultimately on a laptop, because, the time was so compressed. And then you sort of end up in this situation, I think, where it's like, you're sort of like, I'm watching this like 2-hour test that I shot, and I don't even know if I can discernibly tell the difference between some of these. You know what I mean? And I'm having like, it's hard to get a director's attention. They don't have a lot of time. So inevitably what ends up happening is you have to just like scan through it very quickly with them and be like, this is what I resonated with. What do you resonate with? And then eventually you're just like, you're sort of like, I think for us, the big decision started with, I think I did 4 different camera tests. It started with shooting on the Venice and the Alexa Mini, or the Mini Atlas, and then looking at 3 different lens sets on each of them. And then the next time we tested 4 or 5 sets on the Venice, because we had kind of settled, let's go with Super 35 with the Venice. And then I was testing, once we settled on a set of lenses, then I was testing filters and literally just like gels, or like you had a sky panel set up and then a 5K with, a variety of gels. And so I was testing those in order to see how they would fall. And also, so I didn't have a DOT on at the time, so I could build my LUTs with specific colors already built. But it's, that's the sort of thing where I'm not like a bits and I'm not like a zeros and ones, like sort of person. Like looking at a chart doesn't do anything.
Oh, it doesn't help anybody. It's great for building LUTs to match cameras.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's like actually looking at them, I'm like, no, I actually want to just like go shoot a scene and then I'll know like, oh, this works or this doesn't work. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Not like I'm looking at like Christmas lights and a lamp and some like charts. And I'm like, I don't, what the
those are
this.
Yeah, no, those are only good for lens tests. Yeah, and like for objectively looking at like, okay, that's how a point source will flare. That's how, I don't even really think you need a color chart, but if you don't put one in, people are going to call you an idiot. But like a great card will just tell you how the lens skews, Yeah. That's what I was going to say about the C500 actually, was like convincing people to use it. I'm like, it's easier to use this camera than other cameras, A, because I just know it, but B, like you're saying, at a certain point, all these cameras are so nice, it comes down to workflow. Like the bits and bytes don't quite matter when everything looks so good. It comes down to what's easy to, if you've got 5 lenses in front of you and they all kind of look the same, it's like, all right, well, which ones are all geared in the same place and like, aren't going to shatter on me, or like maybe, are just the least expensive, I think all those workflow, because what's that quote, like experts talk about logistics, amateurs talk about something, experts talk about logistics.
Another quote.
it's some military general was just like, when you're younger, you talk about like, the translation would be like gear and focusing on that. And then when you're an adult, it is logistics. It's figuring out how to get the thing done with the correct result while still maintaining ease of workflow.
Yeah. I mean, even like, I think that's been something that steered me away from like, even on Saw, I would say that I steered away from actually vintage lenses, partially because the time it takes to switch a lens. And also like my camera team, for the most part, there was stability within the camera department, but we did have people shift in and out. And like, we did have a shutdown from COVID on that movie. And like, so you also need gear that like a variety of individuals can show up and know how to use and work. And even on like this last movie I did, Bone Lake in Georgia, it's an erotic horror thriller. We wanted a really strong look. The director and I both love the Hawk V lights.
Yep.
But part of why we aimed for the V lights was there's a 55mm macro in that set. But unfortunately, in Atlanta at the time, that was unavailable. And we were going through Keslow, and I'm sure they had it. But, or if they didn't, they could sub-rent it. But when you're talking about renting a set of lenses that's that expensive, because the Hawks are just pretty expensive.
Yeah.
We were running into issue, like we ended up having to carry specialty lenses for a lot of the movie, and we couldn't. And frankly, we ended up, after like a little bit of shooting, I ended up carrying a 14mm spherical lens because we were doing enough multi-axis moves in a house that the wide angle anamorphic lens with the 3-foot close focus was killing us on these like push in, pull out, move, and it's like a long take that you can't, and like we can't afford it. And frankly, anamorphic's giving us very little in terms of like, there's no real, I mean, it's the widest angle anamorphic in the set, whatever it is, a 28 or a 35 or a 32, I don't remember. But it's like whatever that lens was giving us, it's like, no, it's giving us a little bowing and some bokeh occasionally, but not really. Like it's a wide angle shot.
Post.
Yeah. So ultimately, yeah. So we just decided, you know, I was like, I need a 14 that I can just carry, you know what I mean? And not like fight. Like when we want these big wide angle masters, like we'll crop it in post and like we'll get the shot, you know? So even on that, it's like we spent all this time and energy and resources to get a very, you know, get the Hawk in a Morphix. I think we used a Hollywood Blackmagic wand, you know, with that. And like we were pushing for a very specific, distinctive look. But ultimately at the end of the day, like both on that movie and Saw, I carried extra lenses. On Saw, I carried a 200 millimeter and a 180. And I also carried a 12 millimeter. And it's like, there were enough times that I was like, I want this, or I need this, you know, and that we just carried them the whole show. And same like Bone Lake, we carried a probe lens the whole show. So I was like, nice. We're doing enough. Like, yeah, we do some weird, fun probe lens stuff on that movie that I can't wait for people to see, which was difficult to like because it's a T13.
Yeah, I was going to say, is that like a T11 or whatever? But
yeah, so you're like, but yeah, like, you know, I had enough manpower and firepower that we could do that on that movie. And I think I told the director after that movie, I was like, I'm not sure I'll shoot on the Hawks again for a long time because the amount of challenges we had with it, using diopters and close focus was deeply challenging and restrictive. And at a certain point, you have to say, well, you know, I've seen the movie and I'm like really happy with the way it looks. But then it's like, is there another set of lenses that we can get this with? Or is there something that we're not fighting the close focus of so much? You know, I mean, I'm talking almost every shot we did was a diopter involved. And it's just painstaking when you're trying to move quickly to constantly have the diopter be in and out. And there is a precision involved, which there is something I really like about that, which is like, you know, you can't, especially if you're using a diopter, you have a set range of focus. So like there is a precision involved in that. That's nice where you're like, this is the shot. But you know, this was still the movie, even though the first movie I'd done for Shudder was 18 days with this director, her name is Mercedes Bryce Morgan. And then this movie I did with her was 18 days, you know, 6-day weeks. We just had a lot more money. So we scaled up in terms of what we could do and how we could do it. But, you know, ultimately like speed was still of the essence. And it is on every project. And I do think if you let speed be the only determining factor, you know, you could end up, everyone would be like zoom lenses on, you know, the fastest possible camera. And I'm like, that's not necessarily the look for every movie, you know, and especially because most zoom lenses can't open up past a 2.8. There is something special that happens at a 2 or 1.3 that a zoom lens just can't replicate. But, you know, I mean, sometimes it's just the right way to go.
Yeah, the last zooms, tested those Tokina zooms, the Vista zooms, and those are quite nice. And then I don't know where they are. Laowa sent me their Ranger full frame zooms.
Yeah.
And I'm noticing that all of these Chinese companies are suddenly coming out with really great lenses, but don't, you know, like the Ranger zooms are great. You know, they open up to a 2.8, I believe, full frame, geared nicely, very lightweight, little long, but certainly no character in. You know, they're like optically perfect. There's a little CA, but like optically basically perfect. You know, they don't breathe or anything. And that's great for a lot of reasons, but sometimes you do want a little something that a zoom doesn't quite give.
Yeah.
I did want to ask about lighting because in a movie like shit, what was the John Travolta one you said?
Moblands, yeah. It's called American Metal, and the distributor changed the name, and we were just like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
Like American Metal is so much better than Mobland. It's what about far done.
I was the second unit on this one movie that went through, like, we were filming it, and the director Ed was like, I don't know what this is actually going to be called. They keep changing it, and it ended up being Detective Night. And then there's 3 of them. But we thought it was going to be called like Third Night or something like that. And in any case, it was a Bruce Willis film.
Did Brandon Cox shoot that, or was it?
He did. Yeah. I interviewed Brandon. His podcast, I think, is coming out this week or next week.
Oh yeah.
As the time of this recording, people.
Yeah.
Because what happens is I end up interviewing. If I interview 4 people in a month, that's the month, right? But sometimes, like, it's award season, I end up interviewing 15 people.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, when's this episode coming out? Like, I know, like, but I'm not. If I dump them all in one month, we don't have things for people to listen. I want the audience to have something to come back to every week. Anyway, lighting. So Mobland, a little more naturalistic versus something like Saw, which obviously I have not seen Saw, but your Saw X. But I was wondering, like, what kind of, because Saw is in a lot of ways all about kind of I guess extravagance. Like, it is out there. Everything. The first film was such an indie darling, and then it was like, what if we just murder everyone in the grossest way possible? And everyone was like, yes. So talk to me about the kind of like lighting, the approach to the lighting that film, and like some of the fun things that kind of gave you the fizzies when you were able to really lean into that potentially genre and the specific style of Saw.
Yeah, so for a film like Mobland, I designed a visual style guide for that movie, and it's very much was pulling from naturalism. We're looking at images from Larry Clark and Gordon Parks and a bunch of these sort of photographers, as well as looking at, movies like Place Beyond the Pines and Donnybrook and, of course, No Country for Old Men and stuff like that. And so for us, like, Mobland does have like a much more heightened naturalism to it. It's practical lighting, it's natural lighting, it's existing ambient light that we're shaping and stuff like that. For a film like Saw X, I was brought in with, part of the immediate conversation was the last 2 Saw movies, Spiral and Jigsaw, deviated from what the franchise had done. They were 2, 3, 5. They were cleaner. They were more blockbuster in terms of the style, aesthetic, and the feel. And part of what Kevin and myself wanted to do was, how do we walk into this film? It's set between Saw 1 and Saw 2. It's, so it is, obviously the actors are older and we're not doing de-aging techniques. That was a big question and conversation for me, which is like, how much do I try to glamorize photographically these actors to look at a certain age versus, it's got Amanda in it, it's got John Kramer in it, versus accepting that the audience has to make that, that a mental cheat and be like, okay, these people are 20 years older than they were, and that is what it is, and we accept that this is set between 1 and 2.
We bought it with like Obi-Wan and shit. People are willing to...
Yeah, exactly. And also, like, The Irishman has a bit of a deep fake quality to the whole movie that is a bit crazy and weird and off-putting, and even though, some amazing filmmaking. And so we knew we weren't going to have that kind of post-production funds. So part of the vintage quality of the lenses, part of that, yes, that's also a factor that we're considering. And so for the film
one, probably.
Exactly. But ultimately, like, it gives us like this ethereal quality where it's blurring, it's sort of blooming the highlights. And there's a deep fall off in this movie, really sharp contrast, really, heavy, thick contrast. So very dense blacks, and we knew we were going to sort of, for us, the world of Saw was something that has a lot of giallo colors that, I sort of describe Saw as like Seven by way of a new metal video. Like, there's a lot of it, everything has a bit of an exclamation point to it. And so the color in the movie, I wanted the color in this movie to sort of, speak to the touchstones of Saw 1, the original Saw, Saw 2, and Saw 3. Like, I looked at those movies, I looked at the color palettes of those movies, and inevitably those movies came out at a time where DI was sort of becoming a thing. Like, this is early 2000s. They really pushed the DI and the grade like extremely far on those movies.
My memory of the first Saw was very blue, very contrasty.
Yes. Yeah.
Very grainy.
Yeah. And that's accurate. And then 2 has this very like ochre yellow, kind of rusty yellows, jaundicey kind of colors throughout it. And you'll find in some of the traps in Saw 1, like the reverse bear trap, you'll find like the razor wire trap, where it's like the guy inside that razor pit. Those are very like arsenical green, very like, a very rusty, dark, weird kind of green. So I was taking those colors and looking at them, and then our production designer, Anthony Stabley, and the director, Kevin, and I were all looking at those colors and talking about our palette. In Saw X, the script, and this much is available even in the trailer and sort of online right now. There's, the film sort of follows John Kramer. It takes his point of view. It's very much set in his world, and it's subjectively in his space. It follows his emotional story. He is the protagonist of the film. And so the camera work and the lighting also bends to that. And in our movie, it's like John Kramer starts in the US. He discovers the possibility of a kind of cancer treatment that is experimental and not, being performed in the US. And so he ends up going to Mexico in order to get this experimental cancer treatment. In the process of that, he ends up discovering that he's been scammed. And then, the people that have scammed him, become a part of these trap sequences. So in our world, we sort of are playing with, there's really the movie starts in a very just dramatic character drama sort of fashion. We're with him, we're a part of his world. We're using monochromatic silvers and blues and whites and grays for our US. And then when the movie ends up in Mexico, we're leaning into those golden colors, those lush greens. We're leaning into these kind of maroon crimsons, these golden colors. And then once the scam starts to happen, we sort of, we arrive at like a very beautiful, like sterile white. And you'll see it in the trailer. Like there's these sterile kind of clinical whites, within this sort of this cancer surgery that's happening. And so the movie kind of arcs into this moment where it's like the most like clinical neutral palette, and then it arcs out of that. And as it kind of moves from this, this sequence, and we have to figure out what is the most saccharine like version of Saw, like what is the most like high, what is the brightest, most cheery, like high key version of Saw. It's some of those images are in the trailer even, and it is how we light it. It is like, once we sort of, the movie still has deep shadows, it's light sort of, pinpricking into darkness. It is kind of like etching images out of the blacks, it is sort of pervasive, right? And then the question is, how do I work this palette that's been built into the design and is also in the wardrobe into the lighting itself? And so I'm looking at, okay, well, before things shift in the movie, it's more golden yellows. And when they shift, they're more ochre and more like, we're specifically using an Oklahoma yellow. It's something I played with on the very first movie I did, and I just love the look of it.
So this is actual gels, not the
we're using
gels in the sky panel?
It's both.
Or whatever.
Yeah, it's both. Like ultimately, most of the movie takes, once this scam sort of happens and things, the abduction sequences happen. The abduction sequences for me, I sort of saw the movie as happening in 3-dimensional color space. So every scene has a primary color that is playing over top of the scene. Within the background, we're working in accent colors, and we're working tertiary colors within that. And then we're using some degree of keying and filling to sort of play with those palettes. So, and I knew that even though in this course of the movie, and most of the traps are set within a main game space, I would say, which is typical of most of the Saw movies. Right. I didn't want every trap to have the same look across the board, because you're talking about maybe 2/3 of the movie or half the movie all playing out, in a certain sort of trap space, right? And so for me, what that meant was, if we jump into the mindset of John Kramer, I know I'm having to shoot 360. I know I need to think I'm going to see everything. So I need to design a world that we can set cameras inside of, that has dimensionality, that has, darkness and depth and gravitas to it. And so for me, what I did was we sort of designed a base lighting for the warehouse and for this main trap space, which is industrial fixtures. It's in, all industrial housings. I worked with the set decorator and the art director, as well as the production designer, to design what those would be. And so what I did was I took the space, I threw it in Photoshop. And part of the challenge is the sets are not built into the space until later in the process, because you need approval from producers and director. You need, it's a big spend, right, to do all that kind of construction and all that sort of work. So I'm only seeing all those set builds later in the process. And I'm still having to think about how I'm going to light it in advance, because I have to rent gear, I have to rent all the tools and know what I need. In our case, it was a giant warehouse in Mexico City, and I basically tented all 4 sides of the warehouse. We put sky panels and maxi brutes and, around the edges of the house, or around the edges of the warehouse, and they're sort of designed to push light in, and they're kind of my background layer. Then I have lights uplighting and doing lighting around the edges of the space. I've got green sort of industrial, they're not puck lights, but it's Astera, AX1s or AX3s or AX5s.
Have you heard of the hydro panels?
I have.
I got a box of them right here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I need them. I'll let you borrow them.
I mean, one of the challenges was, what do we have available to us? It was in Mexico with the gaffer I had, it was the aperture, whatever the bulbs they had.
Oh, the bulbs, B7C. I think.
Yeah, those lights. So I had a range of LED, and then what I had done is I think I had 40 or 50 lights designed into this space. And then I had probably 50 emergency lights for some of the cues in the movie. So essentially what we did was we designed base lighting for the room, and then ended up designing every trap has its own unique lighting look. But because it's built within the world of John Kramer, for me, that meant when a trap is initiated, circuits are timed with that trap that flip on and bring on lights overhead or within the trap. And then when the trap ends, all circuits associated with the trap shut off. So the trap itself shuts off, all the lights connected to the trap shut off and over top of it. So you have this...
It's a great way to fit into a story.
Yeah, and you have this game room that's sort of constantly shifting. And so it gives you the space for tonal shift within the movie, as well as then what I was able to do is backtrack what those palettes were, and then the abductions could be a really strong color that was reflective of a tertiary color in that future trap that you see in the movie. So it's sort of designing color separation, because I wanted to have those arsenical greens, those crimson reds, those deep blues. We didn't want cyan in the movie. We wanted it to be green or blue, but not cyan. Cyan felt too storybook. It felt too Pan's Labyrinth, too there's just, and there's a blockbuster feeling. When I see cyan or teal, I'm kind of I'm in a blockbuster, and we wanted something grimier, something a little grittier. And so for us, it was I designed the space, but even saying I designed this, that meant that I'm working with a Mexican crew. Their English is not amazing. Some of them is, but for the most part, I don't have very good Spanish. So I actually
10 years in LA and you don't know.
Yeah, I know.
Own it.
I know. Just don't know very much. I know, I knew how to ask for, verde and roja, I need green or I need red, but no, I just have bad Spanish. And so
you got to learn the whistle.
Yeah.
you put it in the, and they always go, yeah, I got it.
I created a document with location stills, Google Doc. I kept everything in Google Docs, and I had a document in Google Docs that had every practical listed for the movie. It had every lighting setup for the movie. And so there were overheads. There were a mixture of overheads and drawings where I would just take a location still and I would paint in it's an M90 pushing this from this side. And so I had all the colors worked out there. And then for the material in the trap space, one of the great challenges you face is we're shooting the control room out and then shooting the main floor out at separate times, because you can't have your crew moving up and down, up and down, up and down all the time. It's too much time. But as a result, you're looking through the windows of the trap, the control room, and seeing the world outside. And you have to know, where am I headed with my world outside while I'm shooting inside this control room? And so what I did was I created a document that every scene listed, and then I did reference images for every scene, and I had it beat it out that way. And then I did just one that had no visuals and was just the color palettes listed for every single scene. That way, when I got into the thick of it and we're jumping from scene to scene to scene where there's a lot of intercutting, because it's Saw and there just is a lot of intercutting. I think there's 4,000 edits in the movie. So it's, you know, it's a fast cut. I had to have that sort of plotted out so that I never lost track of it. And in that process, it's like, you know, I had to have all those units available and rented. And then once we did get into a situation where like I operated for 4 or 6 weeks on the movie, I got COVID on the 4th week. And the director tested positive 4 days later. So we did shoot for 2 days where I had COVID, and I just was in a trailer right off the set with like PNC running into 2 monitors. I had my lighting, you know, plots. I had my ops on headsets and the gaffer on a walkie, and I had the A-cam operator who'd been on the movie, and he also was he bumped from B-cam to A-cam, and he was our second unit DP and
field promotion.
Exactly. And so I basically was like, well, Edgar Lizania, like you communicate with Kevin about setting these frames, because frankly, Kevin had, you know, 7 pages of shot lists for every, I mean, a lot of the traps are shot in a day and a half. So it is not like, it is very fast, you know, and we did do one final day that was all inserts. And so we were able to clean up a lot on our insert day, but you're shooting, you know, a ton of prosthetics, a ton of stunts, a ton of special effects, like just a lot of, every department is playing in some way, right?
Right.
And so...
And those don't get kicked off to second unit for you guys then, because they're just so integral to the story.
No, the inserts or the...
Just all the trap stuff.
No, I mean, Saw is the traps, you know what I mean? Like everyone is going to see the traps. And so our second unit was mostly like landscape stuff from Mexico. It was like that kind of
pretty chill gig for them.
Yeah. And I think we only had 3 days of second unit. Everything else was all main unit. And we were running 2 cameras. So it's like, yeah, the traps are integral and the traps are the film. Like, you know, everyone's going to Saw to watch the traps. So for us, it's like, it's a lot of fun. You know, I mean, it's really violent. You're showing up to set with like dismembered legs and arms on, you know, and you're like, oh yeah, this is my workspace. This is what I'm doing here. But for me, it was also, I was able to rig lights for, I think we had 1 or 2 days of pre-rigging, but this is all happening while they're testing traps and stunts on the main game space. So like, you know, you can't run a Condor on a space that there's a stunt team like in the way of. And so we ended up having to do all of the only like pre-lighting I got to do was the Saturday before we started on a Monday. We finished finalizing where all the units were set. And then I was able to take my black magic around and set rough levels because I didn't even have the main cameras available to me. And then...
So you're not a light meter guy?
I would use a light meter, but in this case, you're looking at... I was looking at... Basically what I did was I looked at all 4 directions of the warehouse and put a person in, and then was like, you know, the one advantage of a movie like Saw is once people are in their traps, I mean, they're not
going anywhere.
No, I kill a lot of it. So you are actually able to, like, you know, you can figure out where you're keying them from. Inevitably, it's harder to key from below or from the side because the nature of the traps, but you still have to. And like, you know, it's just a part of it. So I do use a light meter, but in a case where I have like 40 different units and I'm like, you know, I wanted to know when we turn a Venice on, it was going to look roughly what like I needed it to. I just used my black magic with false color and a monitor and just, you know, looked around the space and was like, this is good enough. And then once we got into it, luckily, when I got COVID, we were already into it enough that I could, you know, sit and dial units. And I had like eye lights on both the cameras. And then I was able to at least still communicate, hey, can you bring a fixture out and like lift their eyes or whatever. But, you know, we're shooting 80 shots a day or whatever. It's a crazy amount of coverage because you're doing the trap all in one day. So it's like, you know, and the aesthetic approach is like mostly handheld for once we were into that material. But then we need our sort of buttons, like, the big dolly push, the techno crane. I think we had 4 or 5 days of techno crane. So you're trying to figure out how to work those shots in and like land the head. And, I also was shooting under crane, this classic circular dolly track, under cranked, like, low shutter speed, kind of, whipping sort of shots and stuff like that. So
right.
It's like you're working with the speed that you have, but then I sort of looked at it as like, I'm lighting a space that has like fall off and that has like, these deep, like chiaroscuro sort of like shape and shadows. And I'm using that kind of, and when we're looking at in pre-production, of course, we're looking at the early Saw movies. We decided on 185 partially for that reason, because all the other movies had done that. But frankly, in our trap spaces, it's like you have monitors, you have close-ups of John's face, you have, traps that involve height disparity between the control room and them, so there's a boxiness to some of that just 185 made a lot of sense. And so we actually shot 4:3 with a 185 like frame, pulled out of that, because Kevin, I was like, do you usually shoot, because Kevin's edited for his entire career. He's been an editor, and he edited Saw 1 through 5. He's done a lot of other horror.
Oh, no shit.
Mm-hmm. And he directed 6 and 7, and then he's directed like this movie called Jackals and some other movies. And so Kevin has, he's really a great storyteller, and he shoots like an editor. That's part of why there's so much coverage. They'll without giving anything away, it's like, a basic something that happens in a movie. It's like someone getting hit in the face and like falling to the ground. Like, some directors I've worked with, we would do it in one shot, and we're pushing in and they hit and fall, we tilt. That with Kevin, it's like a shot for this, a shot for the land, a shot for them sliding, across the floor. And I see the cut and it works, but it's a different way of showing action, where it's like the action happens in these beats. But then you just center punch a little more. And he's like, yeah, I usually end up reframing on almost every movie. And I was like, well, one of the challenges of 185 at 69.9 is just you have very little reframe if an operator fucks up or whatever. And it happens, including myself. Like it happens when you're moving fast. So once I looked at the specs, I was like, well, we're technically not losing anything on the left and right when we go to the 4:3 versus the 17:9. So I was like, let's shoot 4:3. And it didn't become a thing we used a ton, but here and there, it was like, it added a little bit of data and, and it added some time for processing. But overall, it's like it gave us that flexibility to make those adjustments, which was super valuable. And
you can release it in IMAX.
Oh my God, we could, I guess, but I don't think it's. You want to see your gore in IMAX? I mean, look, it would be fun to see it in IMAX.
I guarantee you some psychopaths want to see it in IMAX.
I've seen the HDR, I've seen the SDR, I've seen the DCP, and then Kevin just watched the Dolby Digital. So like we have seen it, and that process is a little frustrating, because it's like, every screen is slightly different. And even if you're, we did our color up in Toronto, and then we watched the masters down in LA. And it's like, I wrapped doing the DCP the day we finished color. So like, technically I was able to set some of the like transfer from the DCP to the SDR and HDR, but I wasn't in the room for most of it. I set like some, scan through it and get those passes, because we had 2 weeks to do color, but it was technically 9 days. And frankly, it, is 4,000 edits, and it's a lot of material to put together. And the colorist I was working with did a fantastic job, but also he was an in-house colorist at the post house that had the deal. And so frankly, like, he hadn't watched the movie when he started, and I was like, oh, like, we got to set looks for the movie, which took us a couple. Yeah. So anyway, we took that whole time to get the DCP in the right place. And then, you watch the HDR and the SDR and you're like, well, I would like to change this little thing or this. But by that point in the process, it's like, no, this is the QC pass. Like, unless there is a technical flaw, not something you dislike, but an actual problem that requires them to spend the money to open the project back up and, finesse it, you're not going to get that. Right. So, it's a process. Like, it really, it was a lot of fun to light this movie. And it was a lot of like, I loved leaning into those, those big color, like when people see it, they're going to see the Giallo references. They're going to see, they're going to see like this heightened color palette. In the traps, I go a little more heightened. But ultimately, my question when I'm shooting that is like, what's going to make the prosthetics look good? What's going to make the blood look good? And then also for Saw fans, what is going to speak to the worlds that they've seen, but then be our own twist on it. The colors are not being added in the gray. The colors are baked in the lighting, and, then the grade is accentuating that. So that a lot of my time was spent actually thinking about, I think we had a lot of, every light is embedded into the space. It's built into the space. It functions as a practical light. And then occasionally for certain sequences, yes, I came in and I cleaned it up more. But it's on
with like an egg or an additional key or whatever.
Yeah, a lot of it would be, there's certain spaces in the room we would cut it with like diffusion, and then we would bring something in to fill their faces in. But what I found was the more glamorized we went, the less it felt like Saw. And the more like, as the movie progresses, like the wings of the room are starting to close down and take us more into the center of the room. And I had those lit with like 4 orbiters from above. And I think they were going through opal, but they were very hard. And the more the movie gets into that, the more you're starting to get double shadows and downlights, which is traditionally not what I would do.
Right.
It's not what I would call classically appealing. And frankly, when you have older actors, specifically older actresses, it is not the approach they want. But at the same time, you're talking about people covered in blood, people covered in sweat. I wanted the movie to move from more beautiful into more brutal. And by going from softer wrapping, kind of like softer light, and then to like, it does create an aesthetic, you know what I mean? And I really honestly laid awake at night a lot in Mexico, worried about if I was mistreating the actors with the lighting approach I was taking.
Yeah.
Because I was like, this is so gruesome, it is like any lines they have in their faces, any sort of imperfections in their faces are going to be raked by these lights and lifted up. And but then when I would fix it, I would be like, it's just not as ugly as it should be. Yeah. So there was a balancing act, and frankly, time, every time I brought it up to Kevin, we're like, well, there's probably 15 shots in the movie I would love a do-over. There's probably more than that, but there's at least 15 I can think of. And Kevin's like, we'd still be there shooting this movie if you were lighting every shot, and you're like, you have to accept that that is kind of what it is. And what's been exciting is I was able to be there for the horror convention they released the trailer at. And it's the audience just fucking eats, they really are so excited to see these colors back, this level of darkness back, this level of grittiness, and just kind of, they resonate with it. They know the aesthetic of Saw. And so it's actually been exciting to watch them connect with it. And I felt like what I was able to bring to the table was to bring an elegance to what we're doing. And also because I was able to operate for 4 of the 6 weeks, I was able to actually bring a subjectivity and trust. And frankly, Saw X's, when I read the script, I was thrilled because I'm like, A, I thought it was the best script of the franchise. B, I felt like this is the first movie, you're forgetting the first one because it set it off and whatever. Right. But this is
the first film is its own thing.
Yeah. This is the first movie in the franchise that lives in John Kramer's head. And this is the first movie where we're with him. And Tobin Bell is a legend, and he's a great performer. He's a very kind person. He's, deeply passionate about his work. He's, still will arrive on set hours in advance. And we did have it, because of his age at this point, it was stipulated we couldn't shoot at night with him, which, thank God we did day for night instead of all this night work that would have killed us all.
And earned a nap.
Yeah, right. It's yeah. But he has, been at it for I mean, he's been in everything from like Mississippi Burning to, to these films. So it's like,
Right.
he's a fantastic performer, and for audiences to finally get a chance to like sit with him, and it's actually like, yeah, that was such an honor and, so delightful. And then of course it's exciting when like Billy the Puppet's on, because I'm like, this is my chance to like Billy, I'm like, okay, like let's do like big giallo backlights and like, kind of go for it. And like John Kramer is a bit theatrical anyway. Like he's designing these like beautifully ornate traps to like teach people life lessons. Like, I can get away with a lot.
Right.
So, yeah, like it was a lot, like, yeah, totally different. Every movie is different. Every movie, like I jumped from Saw and on Bone Lake, we were referencing a lot of Crudson, a lot of Todd Hido. It's a much more, Mobland is very like dirty and documentary-ish, like a bit of a docu-reel, like, kind of a neo-noir thing where it's dark and it's got these like, built-in colors, but then it's very like naturalistic and dark. And then Saw is dark in another way, and it's gritty and scuzzy and grimy and, textural and has all the, poisonous kind of color. And then Bone Lake, we were going for a very like sexy, very like erotic kind of film. And so there's a lot more, it's actually this like French photography that's a lot of names, Stéphane Coutel, I think is his name. But he did this book called, and I'm probably butchering all the French bullshit, but Insomnies or Insom or something like that. But it's very just like beautiful colors, like purpley twilight colors. And like Crudson does that too really well. But it's like, so every movie you do have these opportunities to play with visual language and play with like unique, palettes and unique approaches. And right now I'm just like trying to take a lot of risks, and they don't all work, I mean, the critics fucking hated the handheld work on Bobland. Like, they just were like, oh, I hate that it's so handheld. And I'm like, well, we had to make that decision for our schedule, but also it was the decision the director and I have been playing with in all of our commercial work together. And we love Battle of Algiers and French Connection and Place Beyond the Pines. And like, yeah, there were 3 operators on Mobland. There was myself and B camera operator and a second unit DP. And like, you can't make a movie in 11 days. And I'm like, we shot fences and some people hated it. And for some people, they'll be like, I love that it's gritty and it's kind of messy and it's not, ornate. And so like, Saw, like we're playing with the range, we'd have a lot of dolly work and shit on sticks and a lot of stuff that's handheld and techno crane and, some Steadicam in there. So it's like, and then for Bone Lake, there's 2 handheld shots in the whole movie. Like or maybe like 2 little mini sequences that are handheld. The rest of it's, very controlled. So I love getting to work with different directors and getting to play in different spaces tonally. And yeah, it's kind of what I love about it. I have a lot of anxious nights sitting up thinking about all these things.
Yeah. Well, at least those anxious nights aren't the classic. I've spoken to a lot of like older DPs and they're like, man, I do not miss the waiting for dailies and just sitting there and going like, oh, fuck, that was the most important scene. Is it okay?
Yeah, I've never shot a movie on film and I would love to. But I do think my anxiety would be pretty poignant.
Well, I did want to add, you had mentioned it at the very beginning of this conversation, how, and I wanted to follow up on it and then I forgot until just now. When you were saying that, when you initially shot digital, it was all about basically working in the toe of the image because anything would blow out and look like shit. So when you did that first transition into film, I assume you shot film photography before. So you had like or maybe not.
Not much. I had shot maybe 4 rolls of 35.
Oh, okay.
So really not much. And I had shot one of them. The very first 35 millimeter roll I shot it was a 800T Cinestill. And I went to Detroit with somebody and we were scouting for a project that unfortunately didn't happen, but it was a really beautiful post-apocalyptic idea. And we broke into a lot of places that, were pretty grungy. And so we shot a bunch of stuff there, just like, in scouting, both digitally and on. I shot like a couple of rolls of 35, but the camera, I since started it, but the camera I had at the time, I hadn't tested it, and it was used camera, and the roll didn't rewind. And so I popped the back of the camera off, and I was in a hotel room and I had every light off, but like something in the far corner.
That'll still get you.
It did, and it was beautiful. But all that to say, like, I didn't have a lot of experience with it. I was very like, yeah, I'd shot maybe one roll of 35 millimeter still like film. So when I actually shot my first job on film, I'd actually never shot anything on film.
So that was going to be my question was, what did you learn through that experience about lighting for, because I try to ask every DP about the film digital thing, because I think a lot of people are interested, because most people won't have the chance to shoot film these days, but like lighting for film and just shooting film in general, what are some of those considerations that you learned about? You know, obviously learning, it's pretty fascinating when you go, oh, we need way more light. Like you need, it's not just an exposure thing, because I can just shoot 500 speed film like I would shoot 500 digital. It's like, no. So if you underexpose that by a stop, you're fucked.
Yeah, I think, well, the main things that I did, one was I rated the camera for about 2/3 of a stop. Like we shot on 500T film, and then I rated it for 320 because I tend to underexpose anyway. So I was like, I'm just gonna like, you know, sort of set myself up for success by doing that. And we were going for a darker look.
That's the dude with the bloody hand in the eyeball.
Yep. And that was on 16. And like we, same approach in terms of like 3-dimensional color space, you know, where I'm playing with background and foreground and that. And I think I shot everything 2 stops under, actually, because I wanted to start from that, but I had already rated it 320 to just like keep myself from going too far. And I think the main thing was just, it didn't end up feeling that different. I used a meter a lot more. You know what I mean? And like inevitably, I don't meter much with digital because I just can see it.
And color too.
Yeah. So it's just the speed of like pulling a meter out and then being like, oh, I'm going to take this reading. And I'm just like, I don't need that. But on this, I was taking shitloads of readings. And then, which ended up being like, I think the main learning was I just love the way that film, like the way the highlights roll off. I love the grain. And the texture. I love the way that the colors sort of like mush together and blend a bit more.
Yes.
There's just like that like sort of red rim you get around the lights, which is more of a lens thing and less of the film thing, but it is the film and the way that it like registers overexposure.
So that was like bouncing off the rim jet, right? Like the light goes through all the layers and then bounces back into that red layer on high contrast edges.
Beautiful. Yeah. So all of that was the part of the appeal. And then I actually did a commercial on 16 with the same director, this guy named Joe Michaud. And that was in a way more difficult because we shot 6 frames a second and did undercranking. It was an African-American who was our lead. And we were also doing like deep, like, you know, steep contrast with lots of darkness and lighting a basketball court, like a full gym. And then we did some daytime exterior work, which, you know, I just gave the director the camera and set the stop and I was like, go crazy. And so like, I think the advantages were I'm actually like my paranoia about things I've already seen. I can be a bit like perfectionist and fidgety. And like, I didn't like this Bone Lake was my first union film and I wasn't able to operate the camera because I joined the union and while like in pre-production and they were like, you're not going to be able to get a letter of intent and like be able to actually put yourself in the operating shoes. They're like, maybe you'll get to operate 4 days in this 18-day movie. Like, so I was like, well, I'll just accept that this is where my career is kind of going right now and just, you know, try to learn and grow. And so I ended up at the tent a lot on that movie and I didn't like that. But the images look great and I was able to dial in like images pretty substantially doing that. But I think with film, I was sort of like, well, we know the range of what's possible, you know, so let's like, I don't have to worry so much. I can just like and I still kept like a DSLR or Blackmagic like set to the same stop just so I could do a quick like, hey, am I completely full of shit here? And
I used to use Polaroids to do that.
Yeah, which is wild.
Yeah.
I guess.
Unreal.
Yeah, but I would say like what I loved were the results. Like sometimes with digital, you see it on set and then you get back and you look at it and you're disappointed by the results. And with film, my experience has been, it's got something unexpected every time. And like even the rollouts, look beautiful. And
those are always fun.
Yeah. And you're just like,
for the sound of it, that's terrifying.
Yeah. And so part of me is like, I really do want to shoot in there. I've done a music video that has a narrative structure to it, and I've done a commercial on it, but I haven't actually gotten to do a narrative project. And part of the challenge of that was also on both of those projects, the director and I were putting in money or time, neither of us was making money. And so we weren't backed so heavily that I could just be like, let's just go waste a roll of film, or let's just go shoot some like fun imagery together. And I want to underexpose this to the breaking point and overexpose this to the breaking point. So ultimately, I would say I not played it safe because I still was taking some risks with those images, but I played it safer in the sense that I'm like, I'm not going to like, shoot this 4 stops under and then try to bring it. I was like, no, like I'm going to protect my negative, and like I'm going, I was just a little more conscientious of that. But I love the results, and like there is something about it that I just can't lay it. I add grain to stuff, I fuck up the image, I do all this, but it's just not quite the same. And I think film has its place for all the reasons that it's been around for so long.
Yeah. Well, and I also think like I am a firm believer that you can get, let's say 95% of the way there, shooting on a Venice and then making it look like how do you think film should look. And that's great, but it does take a lot of effort, or it can take a lot of effort. And there is something to be said about, I have a theory that friction in any form will stop you from creating. So like I was talking to this one kid on Reddit the other day where he was like, I have this Canon DSLR, but I really want this Fujifilm. Am I being stupid? And everyone was like, yeah, you're being stupid. Learn to take photos, dude. And I was like, to be fair, if you don't want to pick up that DSLR, you're not going to take pictures, even if you love photo. Everyone's trying to tell this kid like, oh, you don't love photography. You're, borderline telling him he's a poser. And I was like, but if you have a tool like a camera, the little Fujifilm, whatever it was, XT20 or something, and it makes you want to pick it up and use it, honestly, that velocity is going to carry you further than being an expert. So in the same way, like, yeah, you can make digital look like film, but if shooting film gets you what you want quicker and you don't have to think about that anymore, again, that velocity can carry you a lot further. Certainly there's workflow considerations, but I've kind of flip-flopped on my position on like the importance of film. And now I'm like, actually, I think it is more important than I used to kind of give it credit for. Because I love shooting film, but I never thought of it as being like necessary. And now I'm like, there are definitely like reasons to want to shoot it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just even, it's like there was never going to be an opportunity for me to do a film out from like for Saw. And it's like, I would have loved that. We talked about it for all these movies because frankly, for Mobland, like for Saw, I have 9 days to come. For Mobland, it's 3, and it's like, cool. This isn't, there's no
3 is wild.
Yeah. The only reason we were able to do it was Jacob McKee was the colorist, and Jacob's fantastic and does a lot of short form. And I'd worked with him a few times, and our process on that was he sent me a bunch of like probably 45 stills, and then on Frame.io, and then I went through, gave notes on all of them, and then got another batch, and they were much closer. And then, so by the time I went in, it's like the movie actually was already like dialed. And then I was just like watching the movie, hitting problem spots, you know what I mean? And basically doing that for the course of like 3 like 6-hour days or something, it's not enough time. But it is enough time that you can at least like, you can kind of get a sense, most of the time I'm not it's just different on every movie. I always ask for as many days as I can get with color, but sometimes, you know, they don't want to go with, like, they just refuse to spend money there, which is crazy. But
it's such a vital part of the image. Like, it's not just polishing. Like,
yeah,
the cameras was that Steve Yedlin kind of idea of, like, the camera's just a data collection device. Yeah. Whereas with film, like we were saying, like, you get the image there and the color really is polishing. But like, I've said this a few times on this podcast, like, cinematography has 1 foot squarely in the color grade. Like, it's not, they are inextricably linked. You can't, you know, undervaluing that is you do so at your own peril in many cases.
Sort of like, and it's the most insane thing to me, because you're like, we have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars getting a certain camera system, getting lenses, right? Finalizing the lenses, building these fucking sets, building, like, doing all this work. And then you're like, we're going to run it through something that will change the tonality and palette of every single one of those decisions. Right. And if we're not going to invest in that process, you're going to end up with subpar results. And like, that just is so mind boggling. In fact, I've learned, like, I colored both of those things I shot on 16 millimeter. I colored because partially I've colored, you know, I colored one of the movies I shot, and I've colored a movie someone else shot, because when I first started, I just couldn't afford colorists. And so I was middle air resolve. But the advantage is also, I've seen what can you do with an image? And like, usually what happens, like, Mobland, I have all the raw files. So I did a mock-up of everything. And I've done that on some movies. I've kind of giving up doing it, because what I found with colorists is, doesn't matter how many references I give them from other movies, or even stills I've mocked up from this movie, they are going to do their own thing. And I'm going to have to sit with them and find it together. And like, and that's just the nature of the beast. And like, there's a couple colorists I've worked with who I'm like, you get me, you know, and like, we don't have to sit through a bunch of bullshit to get there. But in general, it's like, all of these people are working with, you know, hundreds of people, probably hundreds of DPs, maybe not, maybe 50 DPs, whatever. They're working with a lot of different DPs in a lot of different contexts. They might be jumping from a toothpaste commercial to your movie. And like, they might be able to do your movie because they're doing the toothpaste commercial. But those are very different aesthetic, you know, driven as different aesthetically. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it really matters. I think you're totally right that they can't be separated. And I feel for the cinematographers in my life that don't have any understanding of resolve, because I have a very good understanding of resolve, to the point that I will talk to the colorists about the node chain and what they're doing, but also with respect. Some of it's curiosity. Some of it's like, you're doing this for a living. Let's find out what your structure is. Right. But then at the same time, I'm like, well, I can get lost in the sauce too. Like, I can, you know, like, I need time to go sit outside. I don't like sitting in a dark room for days on end. I need to go elsewhere and come back with fresh blinders on, so to speak. And that just takes time, and you can't rush that. You know, I hate commercials and music videos where you set a look and then you're done within 3 hours, because I'm like, I don't know. I'm a reliever. I may hate that. Yeah. You know, and I'm like, so, I mean, it does come down to taste. And like, there's some colorists who I think they just have taste that aligns with mine. And there's some colorists who it doesn't. And you can get there with a colorist whose taste doesn't align with yours. But, you know, I sort of have, like, over time, I'm not sure your experience, but over time and working with other artists and working with other, like, gaffers and colorists and whatnot, you're just like, you have to hire the person that does the kind of thing you like. You can't talk somebody else into it. Like, people do what they do well because it's what they keep doing, you know? And like, so you hire the right person.
But it's also kind of, in a lot of ways, it's important to stick to what you do well and not necessarily be so malleable unless you're great at it. But like, I think when a lot of people are starting these days, you know, because every tool is so accessible, there is a lot of like putting yourself out there as a multitasker. Yeah. You know, how are you going to be a DP if you're telling everyone, like, you'll see a lot of people's Instagram, you know, bios. It's like director, DP, editor, producer. And it's like, no one's going to hire you. Pick one.
Yeah.
On one thing and do that.
Yeah. And if you want to do the other thing on the side, it's like, great. But like, that's one of the things I tell a lot of, because like, even in starting to do this as a career, like that was a thing I've had to figure out. It's like, where do I land? You know, and even now I'm like, for years I wanted to do like thrillers and horror. And eventually I'd love to do like, I love world building. So it's like, I would love to do stuff like in a science fiction space because, yeah, I want to build a world around. You know what I mean? It's like, I want to build a world. I want to do something like, and I think that, look, I'm 35. So I'm like, there's, you know what I mean? I'm very much, I've done 10 movies and been doing this for 10 years. I feel very much like I'm starting my career, you know, and like, there's so much that I've gleaned in that process and in that time, but it's like, how do you discover your voice? Like the only way to do that is to make mistakes, to like hone what you do well. And then at a certain point to only reflect a certain kind of work, you know, like you're not going to be the person called to do a horror movie. If unfortunately there are thousands of DPs, there are thousands of people shooting. There's, you know, a select number of done movies. There's a select number of done movies that you've heard of. You know, and it's at a certain point, you're like, everyone is looking to put you in a niche. And like, this is why even though I understand that people sort of like don't necessarily buy into the idea of having a reel, I'm also like, yeah, but when I'm a DP looking at 10 operators, I don't watch the work on their website. I watch their reel. And I look at their website to be like, have I heard of any of these? Do I know any of these things? Are these celebrities? You know, just as like check marks. And so I still subscribe to the idea of having a reel because you will be compared to 10 other DPs, and maybe the 10 other guys who have an EDM song and it's like sloppily cut, like having a song that's like, you know, used in Zodiac and you cut to 1.5 minutes instead of a bloated 3 minutes will leave an impression. You know what I mean? And so it's like, I do think there's a value when someone's like got 10 people and they're just like, oh, this person, this person, this person. You know, and that is like, what is your voice? What is your niche? You know, what are you bringing to the table? And it's scary. You know what I mean? There are things I've turned down that I'm like, now that I'm a little older, I would tell my younger self, take every commercial job you ever get offered and make the money and meet the people. And then you don't have to put it all on your website or reflect it all. That's fine. Right. And like, there was a younger version of me that was trying to curate that a little too much. And it just led to not developing new relationships and not making more money. Now I would probably push that further and then just be like, you know, in my narrative work, I would say 6 of the 10 movies I've shot are things no one's ever heard of or will. You know what I mean? And that just is what it took. You know, I'm lucky that I had the opportunity to shoot some stuff. You know, there are people who've done 20 movies, and at a certain point you have to be like, stop doing low budget bad movies. You know, like, you're killing your career, because at a certain point, as you're like, I've done 20 movies that no one's ever seen or heard of. That is a negative, you know, not a positive at a certain point.
Right.
So I don't know. It is tough. It is tough starting out. Like when I moved to LA, I had a reel. That was it. You know, and I worked at a religious organization and shot stuff for myself. I didn't want anyone to think I wanted to do religious stuff. So I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't show any of that work. But then, you know, it's been just Craigslist and Mandy jobs, and, you know, eventually like you're networking and your own contacts and some luck, a lot of luck in there. And also like, I can't go without acknowledging that I'm white and I'm straight and I'm like a man. And there have been jobs I've received and interviews I've had that I'm like, this would have been more, like they would have asked me more questions and asked to see more, frankly, if I hadn't done those things. For sure. So yeah, but I mean, I don't know. It's like, if it's what you love and it's what you want to do, I think to your point earlier, it's like, find the tools that inspire you to tell the kinds of stories you want to tell and the people. And you know, and you just keep setting off until you either go bankrupt or you make it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've definitely kept you longer than I should have, so I will let you go. That was actually like a perfect way to end on like a vaguely inspirational note. But that was a lot of, but that was a lot of fun. We'll definitely have to have you back on.
Sounds great. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Take care, brother.
Frame and Reference is an Owlbot production. It's produced and edited by me, Kenny McMillan, and distributed by ProVideo Coalition. As this is an independently funded podcast, we rely on support from listeners like you. So if you'd like to help, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/frameandrefpod. We really appreciate your support, and as always, thanks for listening.